Photography, like much artistic expression, has its own language, a way of talking about it that lets us know how to define the practice. It has its own vocabulary, or terms that relate to the camera itself and how, using the camera, you actually capture an image, and it has its own grammar, terms that define the artistic nature of the practice. In other words, the editorial content. A photograph is created when an image is captured after the camera's film or sensor has been exposed to light. The term exposure comes from this idea, and it means simply how dark or light an image is. A dark photo is considered underexposed, where not enough light has entered the camera, and a light photo is considered overexposed, where too much light has entered the camera. The camera mechanisms that control exposure are the aperture, the shutter, and the ISO or film speed. As I mentioned in the last lecture, these three mechanisms form the exposure triangle. How you define the parameters of the exposure triangle for any picture you take determines how that image is going to look when you capture it. With each of these three elements, there are terms to know that are related to how they function and how they allow light into the camera. Recall that the aperture is the size of the opening in the lens through which light is allowed to pass. An important principle to remember is that the larger the aperture is, the more light passes through, and vice versa. The aperture is measured in f-stops and is usually displayed using an f number, for example f over 2.0 or f over 8.0. The f number is a mathematical ratio of focal length, which is the distance in millimeters between the lens and the image it forms on the sensor of the films, over the diameter of that opening. If you have a large aperture, that means you have a wide opening and a small f number, and that means you're letting lots of light into the camera. If you have a small aperture, you have a small or a narrow opening, you have a big f number, and you let less light come into the camera. The shutter is the mechanism that physically lets light enter the camera. I like to think of it as a window shade that raises and lowers over the aperture. The shutter speed is the amount of time the shutter stays open while taking a photograph. It's usually measured in seconds or fraction of seconds. The longer the shutter stays open, the more light hits the film or passes through the sensor to be captured. ISO is a measure of how sensitive the sensor of your camera is to light. It originated in film photography from film speed or film sensitivity. Films with different speeds could be used for different shooting conditions. ISO sensitivity is represented numerically from ISO 100, which is low sensitivity, to ISO 6400, which is high sensitivity, and it controls the amount of light required by the sensor to achieve a particular exposure. When lots of bright light is available on, say, a sunny day or in a well-lit studio, the sensor doesn't need to be very sensitive, so you could use a low ISO, and you're going to get the highest quality images at a low setting. When there's not a lot of light available, for example when you're indoors or if you're shooting at dusk, your sensor needs to be much more sensitive to light, so you want a high ISO number. Unfortunately, a high ISO also usually produces a good bit of what we call noise or graininess, so the image quality is not that great. And if you've ever taken photos with your phone camera in, say, like a dimly lit restaurant, you've no doubt come in contact with that noise or poor image quality. You always want to shoot with the most amount of light possible. A lot of DSLRs and most phone cameras automatically adjust the ISO, so you probably won't have to worry about it too much in this class, but it's good to know about it nonetheless. Now I want to talk about some terms that relate to the exposure triangle that define the editorial decisions you make as a photographer when you decide how you want a particular image to look. Focus is how an object appears captured in a photograph. An object in focus is crisp and sharp, and an object out of focus is blurred. Depth of field is controlled by the aperture, and it's a term that describes the amount of image that's in focus. A large depth of field means that a large distance within the scene is in focus, like the foreground to background of this landscape. You achieve a deep depth of field with a small aperture or a large f number. A small or shallow depth of field produces an image where the subject is in focus, but the background is soft and out of focus. Shallow depth of field is often used in shooting portraits or objects or wildlife close up, like this little guy. If your phone has a portrait mode, that's usually what's happening. You achieve a shallow depth of field with a large aperture or small f-number. Movement is controlled by the shutter speed, and it's a term that describes how an object in motion is captured in an image. There are three common types of movement photographers tend to shoot. One is stop motion. If you want to freeze a fast-moving object, in say an action sports shot or an action wildlife shot, you would use a short exposure or fast shutter speed. Another is blurred motion. If you want to blur a moving object, you would use a long exposure or a slow shutter speed. A third common one is panning. If you want to capture a moving object so that it stays crisp but the background is blurred, you can try panning or physically swiveling to follow the object while you're using a slower shutter speed. Perspective has two definitions in photography. It's defined as the sense of depth or spatial relationships between objects in a photo, giving the illusion of 3D space on a 2D plane, and as the point of view of the photographer, or where you place yourself when you capture a scene. Perspective changes based on how you move around your subjects as you're capturing a shot. We'll talk about spatial relationships when we talk about composition in the next series of lectures. What's important is that you move. Changing your point of view or your physical position can allow you to do a lot creatively within an image. For example, forced perspective manipulates your viewer's perception by using optical illusions to make objects appear larger, smaller, closer, or farther away. White balance is the term that describes reducing or changing the color tone of an image. Different light sources emit light of different wavelengths and can sometimes cast different colors or color temperatures off on an image. Light from the sun or a candle is warm and contains lots of red wavelengths, whereas light from a fluorescent strip is much cooler and contains a lot of blue wavelengths. Cameras record these extra colors unless you tell them not to. Many cameras have automatic white balance modes to account for an array of artificial light sources. Contrast means difference, and in photography, contrast describes changes in tones or value and differences in colors. Tonal contrast refers to the difference in brightness between the elements of an image, and this is especially relevant in black and white shooting. When you have very bright and very dark tones, you have what we call a high contrast. If you have a wide range of tones widely distributed between light and dark, that's medium contrast. And if you have a big range of midtones without a lot of white and black, that's called low contrast. Color contrast refers to color relationships between objects in a photo that can call attention to specific areas or subjects within the photos. And I'm going to talk a lot more about this in the next series of lectures. Hopefully, these videos have given you an introduction into the language of photography. In the next series, we'll talk about visual organization and how to frame a shot. We'll discuss the visual elements, or building blocks of artistic expression, and we'll identify principles of design and photography that exist to help us compose the most compelling images we can. Stay tuned.